Okay.
Good evening and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, a co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And thanks for joining us here online, where we've been able to move many of our events in response to the current pandemic and continued need for social distancing. In this virtual format, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, His Truth is Marching On by Jon Meacham. Jon Meacham, of course, has a record of accomplishment in a variety of fields: a top magazine editor, senior publishing executive, Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, professor, and TV commentator. Last week, in his role as prominent historian, he made an appearance at the Democratic National Convention, giving an exceptional speech that sought to put this year's election in an historical context. He'd been asked, as he later put it, to define the soul of America and do it quick. Indeed, Jon has thought, written, and spoken a lot in recent years about the essence of America and our country's ability to renew itself and emerge even from the most turbulent and divisive eras with a reaffirmation of guiding principles. His last book, The Soul of America, explored the perennial conflict between America's worst and best instincts. In short, the battle for our better angels. In his new book, Jon profiles one of the country's best ever angels, the late John Lewis, the sharecropper's son who was born into segregation, joined the civil rights movement, was arrested 40 times, beaten and imprisoned, and went on to become a civil rights icon and longtime US congressman. Jon's telling of Lewis's story is not a full-scale biography, but rather, as he calls it, an appreciative account of the major moments of Lewis's life in the movement. Jon presents Lewis not just as an activist, but a religious figure, highlighting the theological understanding that Lewis brought to the struggle and portraying his embrace of nonviolent protest, not simply as a tactic, but a biblical imperative, an article of faith. In the example set by Lewis, Jon sees evidence that religiously inspired activism may hold one of the best hopes for making the life of our nation today more just. The early reviews of Jon's book have been very complimentary. Kirk has called it an elegant, moving portrait of a giant of American history. And Publishers Weekly observed, this gripping work is deeply relevant to America's current turmoil over racial injustice. In conversation with Jon this evening will be Craig Melvin, who's been in broadcast journalism for more than 2 decades and currently serves as a news anchor and host of NBC's Today Show and an anchor on MSNBC. So, Jon and Craig, the screen is yours.
Brad, thank you. Thanks so much for the honor. And Mr. Meacham, always good to see you, even if virtually, sir. Let's get started here now. With just to echo what Brad said there. Jon and I will chat for roughly 30-40 minutes, and we'll open it up for questions after that. And you guys are already starting to send in some of those questions, and we'll get to that again in about a quarter till. So, Mr. Meacham, it's nice to, first of all, this is very intimate. It's nice to see you in the home library.
Yeah. There are a couple of things off the top, if you don't mind. What you all are witnessing is a sign of the superiority of the University of the South.
Oh, that did
the Wofford College, struggling school in South Carolina, having some accreditation issues, I think, chiefly because of their alumni achievement levels. Craig is an old friend, and the last time we were physically together, I think, was at Wofford, where there's already because he's about 28, already a statue to Craig Melvin.
Yeah.
And I must say also that Brad and Lissa are so kind, but I always consider this somewhat an equal exchange, because when I worked for Charlie Peters at the Washington Monthly, and I was a $10,000 a year man, that was still the salary. Kate Boo once said that she knew she'd left the monthly when she could start ordering an entree as well as an appetizer in a restaurant. Whatever I had of that $10,000, I spent at Politics and Prose. And so I'm always honored to be here. And thank you, Craig, for taking the time. I know you got to get up in about an hour or so.
Well, that's why this thing's going to end right at 9:01. And again, just a shout out to Politics and Prose. My wife, then girlfriend, she lived in DuPont. And occasionally, if I was trying to impress her, I would encourage her to meet me there. So it holds a special place in my heart as well. So you've written about presidents. You've written about the time in which we find ourselves right now in this country to a certain extent. Yeah. John Lewis, why this book right now in this moment? How did it come to be?
Well, I first met John 28 years ago, and I know exactly when it was. It was Thursday, November 24th, 1992. I was a baby reporter for the Chattanooga Times, and I was covering North Georgia. I like to say I was the Atlanta bureau chief, but I was in fact the Atlanta bureau. I ran it out of room 216 of the La Quinta Inn on I-85. And there was a runoff between Wyche Fowler, the Democratic incumbent, and Paul Coverdell, a Republican challenger. It was the last election in America in 1992. Clinton had just beaten Bush, but Fowler and Coverdell had to settle it. And as you know, one of the currencies of power on an election night, if you're a politician, is not to be seen, because you're like a priest, you're supposed to be off doing important things. Usually it's watching TV, but that's what you're supposed to be doing. And I walked into a ballroom in Atlanta, and there in the middle of the room with his wife, Lillian, was John Robert Lewis. And I was already entirely aware of what he had done. And so I went up and just started talking to him. And tens of thousands of people have had the experience I've had, which is immediately being enveloped by a kind of moral force that was not a rebuke, but an inspiration. Being with John made you want to be a better person just because he was so much better. And I asked him whether he missed the movement, whether he missed the clarity of it, the clarity of Bull Connor, the clarity of Jim Clark, the clarity of George Wallace. Because this was the age of affirmative action and, more subtle understandings. All too tragically, of course, as we see in Kenosha tonight and elsewhere, there are plenty of Bull Connors around. And so that's a perennial struggle for us. But it was the beginning of a pretty long journalistic, historical conversation. I was lucky. I was with him at various points in Chattanooga and Sewanee and Nashville and Washington and New York, Selma, Birmingham, Montgomery. And I always knew I'd write about him at some point. I always knew I wanted to. And then came the diagnosis. I thought I had another 10 years or so because he was 80 and a pretty healthy 80. And diagnosis came late last year. And then I took my family down to the annual pilgrimage to Selma this last March and watched him on that bridge for what I pretty much knew would be the last time, except for when he went over, of course, in the cortege. Back to being the John Lewis who was on an NBC special that Chet Huntley narrated called Sit-In 60 years ago in 1960, 61. And yet he spoke with this force. He spoke with a kind of shout. And in the Bible, as you know, and I just realized this is the spirit and the substance we need right now. This is it. And it's not perfect. It's not a 10-point policy plan, but it's a habit of heart and mind that had demonstrable effect in creating a demonstrably better country. And so I called him the next week, told him I wanted to do it. I knew his time was valuable, ever more so. And so I didn't want to take advantage of that. was very clear about it. And he was wonderfully, as ever, wonderfully welcoming. And I told him very specifically that I wanted to write about his theological view. He and I had disagreed for years. We talked about it a lot. You know, Jon really believed that if you and I did the right thing, we could bring about the beloved community on earth, that it actually could come here. I'm more of a Niebuhr guy. So is Obama, by the way. I don't think it could happen in a fallen, frail, and fallible world. But John Lewis did, and he was willing to die for that belief. And I didn't know anyone else who had ever done that. And that's a story that we have to tell.
I mean, you, in the book, you assert that John Lewis is as important to the American story as Jefferson and Washington and some of the other founding fathers. That's a bold assertion. I mean, what puts him in that pantheon, John?
Well, think about it. Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Franklin created a nation state. They created a republic governed by a rule of law, imperfectly and unfairly applied, because the Constitution protected and perpetuated human enslavement. They did set in motion a process of amendment and adjustment that would lead us to a better place, but they didn't rush to that better place. John Lewis took their words and put them into action. And I would argue in this moment when we're debating 1619 versus 1776 versus 1787 versus 1865, I think the country that you cover every day really came into being in 1965, pretty much on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Think about it. Every presidential election in American history from 1789 until 1968 happened under a system of apartheid. Every one. And we're being generous by marking it in 68 because there was not as much registration as there would be. So we've only created the polity, the demographic democracy that we have now because John Lewis and his colleagues forced the country to actually live up to the ideals articulated by the first set of founders. So why isn't that just as important? And the other piece in that is, which is a little dorky, but y'all are here tonight, so you're clearly, you clearly need therapy like we do. Remember, admitting powerlessness over your dorkiness is the first step. Was the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was signed in 1965 by President Johnson. Huge part of the Great Society. Almost nobody talks about it anymore, but it helped create the infrastructure for the demographic changes we're experiencing. And so things really can be rooted in that year. Parenthetically, it helps explain the incumbent president because it's a 60-year cycle where folks who look like me, many of whom live in the region I live in Tennessee, feel that the power of the white structure is slipping away. And statistically, that begins in 65, not in 1776, but in 1965, because John Lewis said the words that Jefferson wrote have to be put into action, not simply professed in marble.
During the course of your research for the book and your conversations with Mr. Lewis, what did you discover that you did not know?
I didn't understand quite how biblical his life was. He was not John Lewis when he was growing up. He was Robert Lewis or Bob. And like Abraham, like Elijah, like Peter, he got a different name when he received his different mission. So when he came to Nashville at 17, people started calling him John. And that's when he intersected with the movement. His family was very uneasy with his involvement in the movement. Why wouldn't they be living in Troy, Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery? His father worried about losing his job as a school bus driver. They worried about violence. He had a lot of brothers and sisters, a lot of targets for the Klan in those years. And he took up the cross and followed the larger vision. He had a period of exile. He lost, John, remember, one of the things that didn't come out, and you and I talked after his death, one of the things about John is he was out of fashion pretty early. Nonviolence, which is now revered, in real time was deeply controversial within the broader civil rights movement. And so in 1965, 14 months after the Pettus Bridge, John loses an election as chairman of SNCC. He lost his family, essentially. Stokely Carmichael defeated him about 15 miles away from where I'm sitting at a church retreat center at Kingston Springs, Tennessee. And John goes to New York and lives alone. And as he said, drinks a lot of beer, read a lot of the newspapers, but he was alone. And what brought him back was Robert Kennedy. In the 1968 presidential campaign, because he saw in Senator Kennedy a different man than had been Attorney General in 61, 62, 63. And Kennedy had grown. And again, if you don't take my word for it about John Lewis's importance, Robert Kennedy said, "John, you have changed me. Now I understand." And so I knew that he was physically brave, but I didn't quite understand the impact he had on white America as well.
You wrote in the book, and in full disclosure, I'm obviously, just came out, I'm not finished with it, but you do write that the decision in 1961 to become part of the Freedom Riders, that was a consequential decision for him. How so?
Two things, both starting and then finishing. It's one of the great moments, and it's not well enough known, and a huge amount of the credit goes to a woman whose name is not well enough known, Diane Nash, who was a colleague of John's here. She was at Fisk, he was at American Baptist College. She married James Bevel, who was a classmate of John Lewis's. She's still going in Chicago. I talked to her the other day, and she was working on voting registration and voting access in the pandemic. So the battle goes on. So he joins in 61. The Freedom Ride was not a kind of a one-off. It had been planned in the past, but hadn't quite pulled it off. But the Supreme Court had already ruled that those facilities had to be integrated. Just our native region, had ignored it. And so this was a ride to test the Boykin decision, which was kind of a follow-on to Brown. First time he ever went to Washington was to get back on a bus and go back into enemy country, his own country. He does it. He's beaten in Rock Hill, South Carolina. As a quick aside, the Klansmen who beat him in the bus station in Rock Hill in York County, South Carolina, in 2009, after Obama was elected, he realized how wrong he had been, and he called Congressman Lewis's office and said, "I'd like to apologize." And John instantly forgave him, and they did events together. It's just incredible, right? Elwyn Wilson was his name. So they head into the trouble spots in Alabama. John has left to do an interview with the American Friends Service Committee because he wanted to go abroad and do some work in India and Africa. So he goes up to Philadelphia, jumps on a plane in Atlanta, I think. And so he's not there for that first day in Montgomery in Birmingham, when things really begin to fall apart violently. The word comes back that the Attorney General, others have asked for a cooling off period. And John is back in Nashville, getting ready to head back to Alabama. The Attorney General of the United States has asked him to stop. He gets on the phone with Diane Nash. Diane says, we have to keep going. He agrees. He drives down to Alabama. He gets on the bus. They drive over. The same drama happens again. He's hit over the head with a Coca-Cola crate. He's arrested. And think about it. One of the things, we all saw his physical courage in the streets and on the bridge. I came to believe that his hours of maximum physical danger actually were out of sight in police custody. Right? That's something else I discovered as I thought about it, because there was no accountability. Maybe he would try to escape. Maybe another prisoner would do something. And 40 times he put himself in the hands of a state-sanctioned violent regime and trusted that justice would ultimately be done. Bull Connor in Birmingham, while they're in jail, comes and gets them late on a Sunday night, puts John Lewis and a couple of other folks in a car, and decides, instead of letting them go on to Jackson, Mississippi, he's just going to drive them back to Tennessee. It's one of the great, Bull Connor's driving, we're not making this up. Bull Connor is driving the car. If somebody pitched this as a screenplay, you'd bounce it because it was too improbable. He takes them to Ardmore, Alabama, Tennessee, which is right on the border, drops them off on the side of the road, Klan territory, turns around and leaves. They walk down tracks because they know that if they're near the train tracks, they'll probably be near a black neighborhood. They find a black house, an elderly black couple who take them in. The man of the house goes and buys food for breakfast from 3 or 4 different places so that he won't tip anyone off that they have guests. John gets on the phone again to Diane Nash and says, we're at the Tennessee state line. Should we come to Nashville or do we go back to Birmingham? And she said, go back to Birmingham. He said, yes. That's an inflection point. And this is, don't listen to me, this is John's view, that if they had given up, if they had let Bull Connor's violence trump the nonviolent initiative, in that moment, they would have lost an extraordinary amount of momentum. And so instead, they go back and they keep going. And by the end of that trip, he is a prisoner at Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi, which William Faulkner described as destination doom.
What did he tell you? And as we're having this conversation, literally in this moment at 8:25, as you likely know, the NBA playoffs have been halted. The WNBA also halted. Major League Baseball players have decided to essentially take a collective knee as well to protest the social injustice that continues throughout this country in the wake of what's happened in Wisconsin. What did he say? What did John Lewis say about the current moment?
Yeah, we talked right after he went to Black Lives Matter Plaza, right after George Floyd. He cried when he saw the Floyd video. He watched all 8 minutes, 47 seconds, I think it was. He believed, understandably, that there was an incredible amount of work to do, but that it could be done, and that it would require the kind of nonviolent protest that the athletes are displaying tonight, for instance, that progress and change are possible. And he knew that, as he would say, not as a matter of faith, but as a matter of experience. He would say, when people say change isn't possible, I say, come walk in my shoes. Because he was born the great-grandson of a slave. He didn't see a white guy besides the mailman until he was in his teens.
Wow.
When he read about the Brown decision, he was excited and he sat around waiting for his new white friends to show up. Right? Didn't happen. He thought they might go to the nice fancy school with the playground equipment instead of the shack that they were in. Never happened. And yet he died, eulogized by presidents, mourned by millions. And so his life is a testament to the possibility not only of progress, but of change. He would be the last person on earth to say that the work is ever fully done. He did believe that we could get to this epiphanic moment, this apocalyptic moment. Apocalypse actually means unveiling in Greek. And so he did believe there could be an unveiling and that injustice could be overthrown, sin could be conquered, and that there would be a community entirely driven by love. But it wasn't simply going to be given to us, it had to be worked for. I asked him to write an afterword for this, quite tremulously and nervously, I must say, because I wanted to, honestly, I can't say between us because people are watching, but I wasn't really thinking about the notion of a kind of last testament, which of course it has become. And I so wanted to be able to answer the question you asked, not through the agency of an author, but from the mouth of the prophet himself. And so he generously did it. And the last words of it are, it's all going to be all right. It's all going to be all right. But it's only going to be all right if we follow the path he marked.
I hope everyone can still see and hear me okay. I just got one of those, your signal is unstable messages. Your
instability is something your friends are worried about. And so actually this was an elaborate intervention you're offering.
I think I'm okay now. Did he get a chance, Jon, to read the book?
He did. Thank you for asking. Yes. And I was terrified. I've had this experience twice now. President Bush Sr. Read the book I wrote about him. He was quite lovely. I still have a couple of wounds from Mrs. Bush's needle point stuff. She sort of whacked me a couple of times. But yes, and he was great. He was lovely, of course. And he understood, this is important because it sort of affirms what we do for a living. He understood the power of narrative. He understood the power of imagery. One of the reasons he went back again and again to Selma every year, taking as many members of Congress as he could get, was not to celebrate himself, but to tell the story. And he knew, because he was immersed in the Bible, that the stories are what have the power. It's not just precepts, right? And the Sermon on the Mount is the one difference. But if you want to see how fallen and frail we are, but we can still do great things, you read about King David, right? If you want to make a point, you read the parables. And so I think I know he was pleased that someone more associated with as you mentioned before, the presidential genre was going to take this on. Not that he needed it, but that it was another voice in the chorus to tell that story and sing that song, and might reach some folks that a different angle of vision might not.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that struck me most about the celebration of his life a few weeks ago, you alluded to this, President Obama eulogizing him, President Clinton eulogizing him, and there was George W. Bush as well. And I remember, I was new to the news business back then, but it was a big deal that John Lewis had decided to boycott his inauguration.
Yeah.
But there was President Bush right there, remembering his friend. What changed in their relationship? How did that dynamic come to be?
How did that happen?
Yeah.
It speaks well of both men. And I thought what President Bush said about we had our disagreements, but we both believe in a country where disagreements are in fact the oxygen of democracy. I think I know what they bonded over was, and Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush was a big part of this, was the Bush's support of the African American Museum of History and Culture. And that was the Museum of African American History and Culture. The Bushes supported that at a critical point. And so I know that that was something that John appreciated. And President Bush signed the Emmett Till Civil Rights Cold Case Act, which made it possible to bring cases that had not been brought. And he appreciated that. And, you know, John Lewis almost died over the sanctity of the vote. And the 2000 election was a complicated thing. And so I admire everybody in this story. I admire John for protesting nonviolently the result in 2000, 2001. I admire him for being open to coming to see the good that a particular president with whom he disagreed could do. And I admire President Bush for seeing the same thing. And they both, whatever you think about George W. Bush, they both love the country. And they both love a vision of the country in which we can disagree with virulence, but ultimately, as John Lewis would say again and again, we are one house. We are one people. And having a former Republican president eulogize you is a flashing light that says we are one country. And I thought it was a profound moment. And I thought it was gracious of the Lewises to do it, and gracious of President Bush to deliver.
He also, of course, famously boycotted the current president's.
Yeah, he was not invited. No.
Did they, and I think I know the answer to this question, did they make any inroads after Congressman Lewis's boycott, or no?
No.
What did he think?
No. And it's one of the sadnesses of the era, one of many. It's hard to imagine two more antithetical figures than the incumbent president and John Lewis in every conceivable way. And that's not a partisan point. I mean, if somebody can think of one, text it. But I can't think of one. And I don't think John Lewis hated the president. I don't think he hated anybody. But he needed evidence of redemption. He needed evidence of progress, evidence of enlightenment in order to build the kind of bridge that he built with the Bushes. And there was none.
Did he talk to you about regrets that he'd had throughout his life?
Great question. He wished that the 1986 campaign, he ran against Julian Bond, his old friend. I mean, they were very, very close. Julian Bond was basically the communications chieftain of SNCC. And that was a very difficult campaign in 86, involving charges of drug use and just unhappy. And that hurt him. That they were estranged for about 15 years, I think. And then Taylor Branch, actually, the great biographer of King, helped bring them back together. Dillard down in New Orleans called up and said, would you ask Julian Bond and John Lewis to come get honorary degrees together? And Taylor used it as a occasion to see if he could bring about a reconciliation. So I think that was a big one. He never got over losing to Stokely Carmichael in 1986. It's funny, you can see him on YouTube every once in a while where people ask him about Stokely, and with great grace, he totally dodges the question. And that was an immensely complicated moment and personal. His pride was wounded. He admitted he would not go back and work for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King's organization, because he didn't believe he could go from being the chairman of a national organization to being a field director for one. So there was pride, and he knew how to win. But my argument about sainthood is not that you're perfect. It's that you're just a little more perfect than the rest of us.
You, not to give away too much for folks who aren't finished, but you stopped the book short of his legislative career.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Because at that point, you get him, right? And his congressional career, while interesting, was not startlingly so. He went to work. He fought hard, but his life became slightly more conventional. And what we need to learn from is the Lewis of the movement. And I think that you watch that courage in action, and you watch that resilience and that insistence on justice, that I think that's what we can learn the most from, and not markup sessions from the late 80s. My opinion, again, take it or leave it, but that's the story that moves us the most.
He talked a fair amount, especially toward the end of his life, about President Obama, and he always talked about his relationship with Dr. King and Dr. King's obvious influence on him. And I've always sort of viewed John Lewis as this bridge sort of between the two. How did the two of them, President Obama and Dr. King, how did they influence the John Lewis that we know?
Well, generationally, Dr. King was an elder brother. He was about 12 years older, I think. John was born in 1940. And Obama could have been his son. So it's complicated, right? President Obama has been incredibly candid about, without John Lewis, he's not president. I debated the question of, without Martin Luther King, is there a John Lewis in the way we know? And probably not. John Lewis certainly would have said that. Lewis, the tributaries that met was this tributary of his innate revulsion against segregation, his faith in the gospel and making it real and part of the earth, not just of heaven. Mm. And then encountering, and this is something about the media that's so important, encountering the Brown decision, the Emmett Till lynching, authoring Lucy trying to integrate University of Alabama, and the bus boycott, encountering those stories in the newspaper and on the radio. And so these three tributaries formed the river that became his life. And he loved Dr. King like an elder brother. He loved President Obama. President Obama, as ever, brilliantly said that Lewis and King were part of the Moses generation, and he was part of the Joshua generation. And again, seeing the world biblically. And one of the last things he did was right after the murder of George Floyd, President Obama had a virtual town hall, and John was part of it. And there's this wonderful moment where Obama says, John was brave, but he was a little dude. And it suggests that even little dudes can make a big difference. And so, was Lewis a bridge between King and Obama? I think there's a continuum. I think there's a continuum. I mean, without the movement, there's no Obama presidency. But the movement also, and I should stipulate this, we talk about these fabled and famous figures because that's the way you tell the story. But we live in a better and ultimately fairer nation because of innumerable people whose names we don't know. And it's Ella Baker and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and people who did incredibly brave things that never made the papers. My argument for hanging a lantern on Lewis's life is there is something innate in human nature that responds to narrative, responds to the story. And if you can read the story of this seemingly ordinary person who became an extraordinary figure, it shouldn't make us think we can't do that. It should make us think maybe we can.
We're going to open it up for audience questions here in just a moment, John, because we're about a quarter to the top of the hour, and I do have to be up.
You got to get up, yeah.
Yes, but before we do that, just one final question: what do you want folks to take away from this? Like, what is the, if you had your druthers, when people read this book, you want them to walk away thinking what?
I want them to think that America can change if enough of us insist that the arc of a moral universe not just bend, but swerve. And I want religious folks who profess faith to try to practice it more fully. You cannot separate religion and politics. And we're at a moment in American life where an extraordinary number of white evangelicals support a president who should not be supported, in my opinion. And instead of dismissing religion as a possible force for good, I wanted to tell the story of someone who used it for unimaginable progress. And if we can bring our political project closer into tune with the ideals of the commandment in Leviticus to love our neighbor as ourselves, or of the Sermon on the Mount, we will be a better country. This is not to say that all progress begins with religion. All great moral secular traditions are based on this notion of empathy. But you asked me why sort of stopping the big narrative in 68. The question I wanted to answer was, why was he on that bridge? And he was on that bridge because of the gospel, because of injustice. And he saw that one could address the other. And if you look at what's happening in Wisconsin, if you look at the structural, both racism and the structural inequality and the structural partisanship in this country, bringing a religiously informed sensibility to those issues is worth a try, isn't it? Nothing else is working.
It's a good spot. We'll take some audience questions. Let's see. This is from David Septoff. David, thanks for hanging out tonight. David wants to know, John, did you have a revealing moment with Lewis as you did with George H.W. Bush?
Oh, that's a great question. They were more cumulative. With President Bush, there was a moment where he sort of confessed his ambition that was incredibly revealing. Lewis was a complicated man in some ways, but in some ways not. I mean, he was what you saw. And one of the things about doing this is, and this, I think this answers it broadly, every other person I've ever written about required what we call in journalism a big to be sure, right? George Herbert Walker Bush was a great man. To be sure, he did X, Y, and Z in the pursuit of power that we regret. but, and then you return, but once he had power, he used it for the good. And I believe that about the people I've written about. I believe it about Thomas Jefferson. I believe it about George Bush. I believe it about Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill. John did not require a to be sure. He just did it. And I think that what was revealing to me in moments together through the years is there was no side, right? It was just, he told you what he thought and what he believed. And he put those thoughts and beliefs into action. And so what was revealing to me was that level of extraordinary character is possible. Rare, vanishingly rare, but possible.
Lynn Gerber. Lynn, also part of the virtual chat tonight. Where did John Lewis get his courage to face death over and over again? Did you discuss with him his fear or lack thereof, or how he viewed his own mortality?
Great question. He never fully lost his fear, but it was he accepted the likelihood, not just the possibility, the likelihood that he would die. He didn't want to die. But once he committed to this existential vision that he was living and would die for this divinely inspired cause, it all fell into proportion. And he was more likely to get tired than to be fearful. He was very young, right? I mean, he was 17 when he came to Nashville. He was 21 on the Freedom Rides. He was 25 on the bridge. But there were moments of exhaustion. He was sort of a homebody too, I think partly because he didn't really have a home for a long time. He was on the road so much. He was moving around so much. When President Kennedy was assassinated, he talked about how all he wanted to do, he was in Nashville getting ready to fly to the Midwest. And of course, the shooting was on Friday and the funeral was on Monday. And he really wanted to cancel that trip and go home to Atlanta. But Julian said, keep the calendar. And so they did that. And then he got home Sunday night and watched the funeral by himself. But he feared God. He didn't fear for himself.
John Zawara wants to know, did Congressman Lewis feel that we are embarking on a new phase in the evolution / founding of America?
He was interested, or at least he feigned interest, as Craig did, in my 1965 thing. More than that, he agreed. We talked about that a good bit, actually. What he was worried about as he died was the resurgence of the old forces, the resurgence of white supremacy, the resurgence of white nationalism.
So what did he attribute that, John? Why did he feel like those forces were on the rise again?
He believed that they were a reaction to progress, not least President Obama, the fact of President Obama. And he had seen this again and again up close, right? That when, Brown happens and there's reaction, but it's not quite as violent as testing the Freedom Rides. And then you get to the vote and they really just go crazy. And so he had seen that violence ramp up, and then felt they'd won a victory that turned out to be provisional as opposed to permanent. So I think he saw the rising hate as a reaction to evidence of real progress, and was very clear about that. And believed that the way to fight it was to fight it the way they did in the 50s and 60s, which is to present a moral case, force them to show who they were, which was the people who beat children, in order to quicken the conscience of the country. That may sound sentimental, but don't believe me, it's what John Lewis believed.
Nancy has an interesting question, I think. She said, John, you've written several books with spiritual themes. Why did you go from presidential histories to spiritual themes?
We're all, as Tennyson taught us, we're all products of what we've met. I tend to think historically and theologically, just because of the way I am. I've got 2 books on presidents unfolding, so it's not a permanent detour. But I think if you write about character, which is the basic theme of all the stuff I've done, is how do people react within the structures of society and history, and how can people shift those structures, and to what extent do our triumphs and tragedies and vices and virtues affect that dialectic again, then it all kind of falls into a certain theme, which is, what is the movie, what are the songs that play in our heads that help us do the things we do? And Winston Churchill saved Britain and much of Western civilization because the movie in his head was he wanted to be a great man like his ancestor, John Marlborough. Franklin Roosevelt was driven to do what he did because, to some extent, he had this vision of himself as trying to outdo his cousin, Theodore Roosevelt. George Bush, the senior, the movie in his head was that he believed that the affairs of the nation would be safe in his hands. Incredibly egotistical, as he would admit, but that's what drove him. So we all have something, right? We all have a rosebud. And in a way, besides the presidential thing, this book has more to do, I think, with the soul of America, which I did 2 years ago. Because my argument in that book was that the soul is neither entirely good nor entirely evil, but it's an arena of contention, as Brad was saying, where our worst instincts and our better angels do battle. And I wanted to be sure I made the point that those better angels don't descend out of the heavens. They emerge from the struggle and the strife and the sacrifice of people who insist that we swerve that arc of history. And so it's not going to bend if you don't have the John Lewises. It's not just going to bend because white liberals in the broad Western sense think it does. You know, again, things work out for me. I'm as I like to say, I'm a boringly heterosexual white Southern male Episcopalian. History's been fine for me. But the point of history, I think, the point of the American story, an inevitable takeaway from the American story, is that we are stronger and better and fuller and fairer when everybody has what Lincoln called an open field and a fair chance. And that's what John Lewis was bringing into being.
I think that's a great spot to wrap things up for the evening. Although, just to follow up, you said you're working on 2 other books.
I'm trying to keep up with you, man.
I haven't worked on book 1. What are the 2 books?
Well, I've been working on a biography of James and Dolly Madison.
Okay.
And I have an itch to, I haven't announced this, so this is news in the dork world. Abraham Lincoln is the only American I can think of to whom it fell to arbitrate single-handedly between two diametrically opposed visions of reality, right? So with the Emancipation Proclamations, plural, he said to those who believed slavery to be wrong that they were right, and those who believed slavery was somehow divinely sanctioned that they were wrong. And most presidents mediate differences. Lincoln at the end did not. He made a decision. And it's fascinating to me, how aware was he of that singular historical role, and what was it about his character, again, character, that gave him the strength to do it? I know all the arguments about it was limited and all that. I'm not arguing that it was the end of evil, but it was the beginning, the end of the beginning of the evil. And so I'm really interested in how Lincoln's character turned out to be our destiny. How we sequence these, I don't know, but that's what I'm down here doing.
All right. Jon Meacham just broke some news from his basement library. I enjoyed this, my friend. I hope the other folks on the call who bought the book. Here's my. Although apparently some have gotten their book signed.
Those are the people I like, so we do that.
I do buy mine on Amazon.
Watch the Today Show. Watch Melvin in the mornings. He is a smart and sane voice in maddening times. And
You're very kind. I'm actually coming.
For all of my jabbing, he's a great man.
You're very kind. Brad?
Well, thanks, John and Craig, for really a meaningful discussion and an inspirational look back at the great John Lewis. I mean, especially in these difficult times, you've made clear why the lessons of Lewis's life are so important to understand, reflect on, and try to live by. And again, the title of John's book is His Truth is Marching On, and you can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that's posted in the chat column. And thanks again to everyone out there who's tuned in. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you, Craig.
You will, my friend. Take care.
Fred.